The room crackled with tension, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. Bright studio lights glared down upon the polished oak table, their relentless illumination exposing every detail, every movement, every twitch of a muscle. The atmosphere was charged, an electric hum coursing through the space as two opposing forces prepared for battle, not with fists, but with words. On one side sat Clint Eastwood, his presence as legendary as the characters he had embodied for decades. Time had sculpted his face into a masterpiece of resilience, etched lines of experience running across his weathered skin like roads on a map of a life fully lived. Though older, his eyes had lost none of their steel. They remained sharp, assessing, cutting through deception like a blade through silk. His very essence radiated authority, not the forced kind that demands attention, but the effortless kind that commands it. Opposite him, Claire Daniels perched in her chair with the calculated poise of a seasoned interrogator. Young, ambitious, and razor-sharp, she was known for dismantling reputations with surgical precision. Her sleek auburn hair framed a face that betrayed no fear, only determination. She thrived in the realm of confrontation, drawing power from every falter, every hesitation she could provoke from her subjects. Today, she had come to dissect Clint Eastwood, to reduce him from legend to relic, and she was prepared to do so with ruthless efficiency. Standing just behind Clint, silent yet unmistakably present, was Barron Trump. At 19, he was a towering figure, his height casting a long shadow over the proceedings. But it wasn't his stature alone that commanded attention. It was his demeanor. He stood with the effortless confidence of someone who understood his place in the world, someone who had spent his life under the relentless glare of public scrutiny and emerged unshaken. His piercing blue eyes, eerily reminiscent of his father's, held a quiet intensity, absorbing everything, missing nothing. He had learned to listen before he spoke, to calculate before he acted. A lesson instilled in him by men like the one seated before him. Claire's voice sliced through the air, cold and surgical. "Mr. Eastwood, you've been described as outdated, irrelevant. Why cling to a spotlight that no longer shines for you?" There it was. The first shot fired. Clint, unmoved, exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Before he could speak, however, Barron stepped forward. His voice, deep yet measured, carried the weight of something beyond his years. Sometimes the brightest lights are those people fail to see. Careful not to miss them. The words hung in the air like a challenge, their impact immediate. Claire, momentarily caught off guard, faltered. Her pen hovered over her notepad, her meticulously planned script momentarily derailed. She had come prepared to handle Clint Eastwood. She had not expected Barron Trump to enter the fray. Recovering quickly, she turned her gaze toward him, her expression sharp. "I didn't realize you were part of this discussion, Barron." Without missing a beat, Barron met her eyes, unflinching. "I'm not. But when someone disrespects a man who has stood the test of time, it's hard to stay silent." A flicker of something, perhaps irritation, perhaps intrigue, crossed Claire's face. She had spent her career forcing people into uncomfortable positions, but Barron wasn't rattled. He wasn't playing by her rules. This was not a boy out of his depth. This was a young man who understood the weight of words. Clint, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, placed a firm hand on Barron's shoulder. A silent, but clear, message. "Stand down, kid. I've got this." "The boy's got a point," Clint said, his voice carrying that unmistakable gravelly timbre that had made him an icon. "But let's talk about the real story here, not some headline you're fishing for." Claire leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "The real story, Mr. Eastwood? The story of a bygone era, clinging to relevance? A time when men like you dictated the world's narrative? Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that the world has moved on." Clint chuckled, the sound low and knowing. He had faced down adversaries far more dangerous than a reporter with an agenda. The world moves on, sure, but respect, integrity, those things don't have an expiration date. You don't get to erase people just because they make you uncomfortable. Claire's gaze flickered to Barron. "You talk about respect, Barron, yet your father's presidency has been one of the most polarizing in history. What makes you think you can speak on matters of legacy and integrity?" Barron's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his expression remained composed. He had heard these attacks before. He had lived through them. He had been raised in the eye of a political storm and had learned from a young age the futility of reacting with emotion. "I speak because I've lived it," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "And because I've learned from people like Clint, who've earned their place in history, not by tearing others down, but by standing tall in their truth." Claire studied him, searching for a crack, a moment of uncertainty she could exploit. But there was none. Instead, she found herself confronted by something unexpected. Conviction. Clint leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze settling on Claire. "You see, the problem with people like you," he said, "is that you think truth is something you can bend, rewrite, manipulate. But truth doesn't work that way. It stands firm, whether you like it or not." Claire opened her mouth to counter, but Clint wasn't finished. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, a lot of careers built on tearing down others. But let me tell you something. You don't build a legacy by destroying someone else's. You build it by standing for something. And when all's said and done, people remember who had the courage to stand." For the first time in her career, Claire Daniels felt something foreign creeping in. Doubt. She had walked into this room believing she had the upper hand, that she was in control of the narrative. But the ground beneath her felt less certain now. The two men before her, one a legend, the other a rising force, had shifted the power dynamic in a way she hadn't anticipated. The silence stretched, thick with meaning. The camera continued rolling, capturing every second, every breath, every unspoken truth hanging between them. Finally, Claire straightened in her chair, her face carefully composed. She would not concede, not openly. But as she glanced at Barron one last time, she saw something she hadn't expected. A quiet strength, an unshakable confidence forged in the fire of public scrutiny. He was not a boy playing at being a man. He was a man in his own right. The interview was over. But the conversation, that would echo far beyond the walls of this room. As Clint and Barron rose, a silent understanding passed between them. Different generations, different battles, but the same unwavering principle. Stand tall in your truth, no matter who tries to silence you. And as they walked away, leaving Claire Daniels with her unanswered questions, one thing became clear. Some lights never fade. They only burn brighter in the face of the storm. Barron Trump's words hung in the air like an approaching storm, thick with meaning, charged with an energy that couldn't be ignored. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out in anger. He didn't have to. The weight of his truth was enough. "The truth doesn't scare me," he said, his voice even but firm. "But your obsession with tearing people down does. You want a story? How about the one where he saved my life? Twice." The air in the room shifted, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Even the humming of the recording equipment seemed to quiet in reverence. Claire blinked, her journalistic armor briefly cracking as the unexpected revelation landed like a well-placed blow. Her fingers tightened around her pen, her confidence wavering. "Saved your life?" she repeated, trying to steady herself. Barron nodded, the flicker of a shadow passing through his expression. It wasn't just a statement. It was something that lived within him. Something that had shaped him. "Yes," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a tremor, not of weakness, but of the profound weight of experience. "But you don't care about that, do you? You'd rather dig up old wounds than celebrate the man who's been my anchor in a world that's anything but steady." A beat of silence, then another. It was the kind of quiet that forces reflection, that strips away pretense. Claire, usually quick to retort, found herself speechless, thrown into unfamiliar territory. "What do you mean, Clint saved your life?" she finally managed, her voice softer, less calculated now. She was no longer an interrogator. She was just a person, one seeking understanding. Barron held her gaze, his own filled with something raw and unguarded. "When my father was on the campaign trail, there was an incident," he said, his voice low but steady. "A credible threat was made against me. Clint was the one who stepped in. He protected me when no one else could." Claire's pen hovered above the notepad, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't the story she had come for. This was something different, something real. "Why hasn't this story ever been told?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Barron didn't hesitate. "Because Clint doesn't seek praise," he said simply. "He doesn't need the world's validation. He just does what's right, even when no one's watching." At that moment, Clint, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice, a deep and steady rumble, carried a quiet conviction. "I'm no hero, Barron. I just did what anyone would do." Barron shook his head, his expression one of quiet defiance. "Not anyone," he said, "only someone like you." The room remained still, the power of the moment settling over them like dust in the golden light filtering through the window. Claire looked down, her usual confidence no longer a shield. She had come for a controversy and instead had found something undeniably human. The cameras caught it all, the shift in her posture, the way her expression softened, the realization that for the first time in a long while, she had nothing left to say. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Social media erupted, not with outrage, but with admiration. The footage of Barron's unwavering stance, of Clint's quiet dignity, spread like wildfire. The world saw something different that night, something beyond politics, beyond headlines. They saw loyalty, they saw courage, they saw truth. People from all walks of life shared their stories of inspiration, moved by the bond between the two men. Even those who had once been skeptical found themselves reconsidering, drawn in by the honesty of the exchange. Later that evening, Barron sat in the family quarters of the White House, a place that, despite its grandeur, often felt lonely. But not tonight. Tonight, Clint was beside him, the weight of the moment still settling between them. Barron turned to him suddenly, his voice quieter now, stripped of the public persona. "Do you ever regret stepping into my life?" Clint's weathered face softened as he regarded the young man beside him, the boy who had become more like a son than just a godson. "Not for a second," Clint said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of choices. "You needed someone, and I needed purpose. Life has a funny way of bringing people together when they need each other the most." Barron hesitated for a moment before pulling something from his pocket, an old, worn photograph. It was a candid shot, taken during that fateful rally years ago. Clint, shielding him, his stance protective, his expression unreadable, the moment that had changed everything. "I keep this with me," Barron admitted, running his fingers over the edges of the image. "It reminds me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite the fear." Clint reached over, placing a firm hand on Barron's shoulder. "And you've got plenty of courage, kid," he said. "That's more than most men I've known." For a moment, there were no words, just understanding, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The world had seen the interview, but more importantly, they had seen the truth. And sometimes, the truth was all that mattered. Barron Trump's words echoed through the room like a thunderclap, the weight of his revelation leaving even the seasoned journalist momentarily speechless. The relentless confidence that Claire Daniels carried throughout the interview wavered, her sharp tongue dulled by the unexpected turn. "Saved your life?" she repeated, her skepticism barely masking the uncertainty in her voice. Barron's blue eyes, alight with a mix of pain and unwavering determination, locked onto hers. "Yes, but you don't care about that, do you? You'd rather dig up old wounds than celebrate the man who's been my anchor in a world that's anything but steady." The depth of his words, unfiltered and raw, seemed to settle over the room like a heavy fog. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every flicker of emotion in real time. But even the operators, usually detached and professional, felt the impact. For the first time, Claire hesitated. "What do you mean Clint saved your life?" she asked, her voice softer now, less calculated. Barron took a deep breath, the emotions of years past pressing against his chest. "When my father was on the campaign trail, there was an incident. A credible threat was made against me. Clint was the one who stepped in. He protected me when no one else could." Claire's fingers trembled as she held her pen over her notepad, the hunger for a scandal replaced by something far more profound, genuine curiosity. "Why hasn't this story ever been told?" Barron tilted his head slightly, studying her as if assessing whether she could truly understand. "Because Clint doesn't seek praise. He doesn't need the world's validation. He just does what's right, even when no one's watching." The room was eerily silent as all eyes turned to Clint Eastwood, the man who had remained still and silent for most of the exchange. His weathered face, lined with the wisdom of decades, bore the quiet strength of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding when to speak and when to let others do the talking. Finally, he cleared his throat, his gravelly voice carrying across the space like the voice of a man who had nothing left to prove. "I'm no hero, Barron. I just did what anyone would do." Barron shook his head, his jaw set. "Not anyone. Only someone like you." The air felt thick, charged with a tension that wasn't born of hostility, but of revelation. The cameras continued rolling, capturing the rare sight of Claire Daniels at a loss for words. She glanced down at her notes, searching for an angle, a way to regain control of the interview. But the story had taken a life of its own. The narrative had shifted in a way she hadn't expected, and for once, she wasn't the one in control. The recording equipment hummed in the background, a subtle reminder that the world would soon see this moment unfold. But even without an audience, it was clear something significant had just happened. When the interview aired that evening, the reaction was swift and overwhelming. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #Eastwood the Protector and #Barrons. Truth trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to analyze the unexpected turn of events, dissecting every second of the confrontation, every flicker of emotion that crossed Barron's face, every measured word spoken by Clint Eastwood. The world had seen Clint's courage. They had seen Barron's unwavering loyalty. And most of all, they had seen the kind of respect and integrity that was becoming increasingly rare in the political and media landscape. That night, in the family quarters of the White House, Barron sat in thoughtful silence, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room. Clint sat beside him, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. Barron finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the public bravado. "Do you ever regret stepping into my life?" Clint turned his head slightly, looking at the young man he had watched grow into something far more than just the son of a president. His expression softened, the tough exterior giving way to something more paternal. "Not for a second. You needed someone, and I needed purpose. Life has a funny way of bringing people together when they need each other the most." Barron hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an old, slightly worn photograph, one that had been folded and unfolded too many times. He handed it to Clint without a word. Clint unfolded the picture carefully, his weathered hands smoothing out the creases. It was a candid shot from years ago, capturing the exact moment Clint had positioned himself between Barron and an unseen danger. The photograph was grainy, but the message was clear. A man who didn't hesitate, who didn't flinch, who acted without a thought for himself. "I keep this with me," Barron admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "It reminds me that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about acting despite the fear." Clint studied the photo for a long moment before nodding, a rare glimmer of emotion crossing his usually composed face. He reached out, placing a steady hand on Barron's shoulder. "And you've got plenty of courage, kid. More than most men I've known." The world had watched the interview, dissected it, debated it. But in the quiet of that moment, in the stillness of the White House, the real story had already been written. The story of a bond that transcended politics, legacy, and even blood. Because in the end, it wasn't just about Clint Eastwood or Barron Trump. It was about the kind of respect that isn't demanded, but earned, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't waver, even when the cameras stop rolling.